Today is Palm Sunday, and this is the beginning of Holy Week when we tell the story of Jesus' last days on earth. Today we read dramatically in parts the Passion Gospel, and a Passion Gospel is crucifixion and everything leading up to that, and different people play all those parts. It's a very dramatic thing, but what also that means is it takes longer than usual, and so they are just finishing the service as we speak. A group will come in here. We'll start right as that happens. The next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday are regular services at night, and then Monday, Thursday comes from a Latin commandment, do this, and that's a Jesus, the Last Supper, acting that out, which is itself a Passover type meal. And then Friday, Good Friday, is the crucifixion, where we sing a Passion Gospel from John at noon. Saturday night is called the Great Easter Vigil, the first Easter resurrection celebration. Then Sunday is Easter, or a celebration of the resurrection. So it's a very full week that's happening here. And this day takes about an extra 10 minutes, so nobody's out of church yet, and they'll come up here. It's not, Marlene, as you know, I didn't know the first time we had high holidays here that you could come and go from the service. Because our services, you're kind of just, once you start, you're just there. It's like, oh my gosh, this is like 4 hours, is it? And even the rabbi goes away for a while and somebody else sings. Is this true?
It's happened, sure.
Yeah, it happens. So it's a different way of going about it.
Yeah, there was a Rabbi Freehoff in Pittsburgh many years ago, great scholar. He was addicted to baseball, and the World Series often came during Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, the high holidays, and he would leave the bin on the stage and go out, I'm sure, to listen to the score.
Listen to the scores. Thankfully now you would just have your iPhone set right up on the bima to tell you. And hopefully he's not reacting in real time to the scores.
I'm sure if rabbis reference anybody that's on a pulpit doesn't like the congregation going in and out. They don't
Is that,
Sure.
How long is in Reform is like Yom Kippur?
Yeah,
Same,
a couple hours,
all day?
2.5 hours.
2.5 hours. So our Palm Sunday service is like an hour and 10 minutes, hour and 15 minutes. Easter, if there are a lot more people, it just takes longer for communion. Were any of you at the 9 o'clock service just now? Yeah, they're not here yet. So they'll come up. We're ready. We have, by the way, as it turns out, is it fair to say probably 4 sessions we could do from this?
Yes.
The topic of purity was by request. I recall, Russ, did you request this? The biblical concept of purity, where does this come from? And as we prepared, I find this, I've learned a lot preparing of some things I knew and forgot, other things I never knew, and then making connections between and among things I hadn't thought of before. So this could easily be a 4-session class, but we'll try to do it in 40 or 45 minutes or so today. Viv, are we rolling yet?
Yeah, I start rolling like 5 minutes before.
Oh, well, we're ready then. Rabbi?
Okay. So to get us started, we'll begin with the prayer we're studying. Yep. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All praise to you, source of life, who has endowed us with texts of meaning and encouraged us to study therein. Amen. Okay, so as John and I were preparing this session about purity, aware that the topic was proffered by you, and imagining what it was that initiated that or suggested that, we imagine it has to do with the Torah or the Old Testament understandings of purity and ritual and holiness. So we want to say something about those categories. And then we want to invite you to sort of travel with us how the notion of purity law, or the notion of what is acceptable or is permitted versus that which is outre, how those concepts are found in every culture and in every generation, and what they mean for us today, or where we can recognize them today, and to appreciate the qualities that biblical purity offers us versus what we understand them to be today. Not per se religious ritual purity, but the nature of what it means to be behaving or proffering belief that is within the bounds, as opposed to what's outre. Okay? So let's just take a look from a high level about biblical notions of purity. Most of them we derive from the book of Leviticus, which is giving lots of information. In contrast with Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, the third book of the Torah, lacks what one of my Bible professors referred to as nouns and verbs. The narrative material in Genesis and Exodus relies on nouns and verbs, and by the time we get to Leviticus, now we have injunctions about what you should do or shall not do, and under what conditions and circumstances, and that's where we learn what was described by way of expectations, communal expectations around notions of purity. Judaism has three large categories that describe these concepts. One is called, we'll start with the first. One is called kosher and treif, has to do with food. What's kosher? It's a Hebrew word which just means permissible. What's that? How it's slaughtered, which animals are allowed, what's kosher food, and what's not. What's kosher and what's treif. What's permitted and what's off limits. Similarly, there were categories of what's called tahor and tameh. Tahor means you're in a state of purity, which is to say you're not defiled. And tameh, if you come into contact with persons, cadavers, bodies, bodily fluids, if you've behaved in a certain way or engaged in certain activity, you may for a period of time be tameh. That means you're outside this, the realm of what's considered pure, but there's always a means of coming back in. The third category is called pasul and asur. Pasul and asur refer to typically ritual objects. So can you use a Torah that's got missing letters? Can you use a shofar, the ram's horn that you blow, if there's a crack in it? Can you, what do you do by way of offering certain blessings over wine if you don't have access to wine? Right? Various other kinds of things, whether it's permitted or it's not permitted in terms of ritual objects. There's about personal status. If you are, if your body betrays a deformity, and I don't want to say that tactfully, that is to say, if you are lame, or if you are blind, or if you are certain other physical or biological defects that would disqualify you for temple service, that's a category. Right? Stephen Jay Gould, the anthropologist, late anthropologist from Harvard, described that what distinguishes human beings from all the other species in the animal kingdom is that we create categories, and we like to classify things, and we like to know who's in which group and how do we organize, and that's the distinction between us and the rest of the animal kingdom. And the ideas about ritual purity are in that exact same realm. They govern whether or not you're in a state of impurity or whether or not you can approach, whether the objects you're using or the food that you're imbibing or the way in which you're going about things, whether it's pure, safe, permissible, or whether it's unsafe, fraught, and unfit for use, are categories around this. Some of them are the most basic of maintenance. You go outside the camp to use the facilities, as it were, as our euphemism. You don't do that inside the camp. If you have just had a child, if you have an open wound, if you have various other kinds of status that we find ourselves in may render you in this category of tameh, or less than pure. However, one of the, I forget which scholar suggested that these categories of defilement and purity in the biblical tradition, at least the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible tradition, were a means of organizing, but it's akin to being asleep or being awake. These are statuses or states that we exist in typically over a 24-hour period. And one isn't good per se or bad per se, but when you're asleep, there comes a time when you awake. And similarly, when you come across something and you've defiled, so think of a Jewish kitchen and a utensil that's designated for the meat category gets contaminated by something dairy, you're now in that state of defilement. It doesn't make the spoon or the fork a bad object. It just means that we need a means by which to reintegrate it into our use. And the exact same concepts run through the idea of biblical and ritual impurity. That is to say, there are means by which to bring you back into society. Are there thoughts about that or questions? You sort of describe from a high level the various categories of purity and impurity, or clean and unclean. It's a way of organizing the community. Here are the characteristics of these biblical purity laws. First of all, they were understood as having come down from God. Now, it may be that it's good practice to engage in these things, and then those ideas get codified, but they're ascribed to God. That this is what God has ordained, is the way in which the community should organize, or you should comport yourself, or what activities you can engage in, and what are off limits. They come from the divine. They're enforced by communal leaders, the priests, as well as communal pressure. Right? The idea of social pressure is a force in and of itself, and it becomes self-reinforcing. That is to say, it may be that the priest would decide if you are in a state of defilement, or if you've gone through those ablutions that allow you to return to society, but there's also a general societal pressure and expectation that you'll maintain your home in a certain way, or you'll only bring certain foods into your kitchen such that we can all eat together. Or there are other ways of suggesting that there are social pressures, and we're going to talk about how those continue to exist by way of enforcing purity laws. The contention is that these laws regulating purity provide a safety mechanism for the community. That is to say that if you behave in these ways, yes, Charles?
We have friends who keep two kitchens
Yes.
in their houses. When did that tradition start? Is that relatively modern, or did it?
Do you repeat the question?
Charles is pointing out that he's familiar with some Jewish families who have two kitchens, or two sinks, two ovens, two stovetops, whatever it might be. And when did that innovation come about? So early in Leviticus, we get descriptions of what foods are permitted and what foods are not permitted, and we have this curious phrase that says you should not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. And that's Levitical. The rabbis in the Talmud, which we codify the oral traditions between the 1st and 2nd centuries, and then the redaction of the entire Talmud between the 2nd and the 5th centuries, begin to explore what does that mean to not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And they determine that it means that milk and meat, dairy and meat, should be separated. That's early Talmudic law. And then the idea is, so what does that mean that it should be separated? How long must one wait if you've had a meat meal before having an ice cream cone? How do you go about re-koshering, making this dish, this plate, this bowl, this fork or spoon? How do you make that fit for use again? And there are means by which of going through that. You boil it and you wash it twice and you do various things to bring it back into a state of purity. It's not a condition that the object possesses in essence. It's a category or a status that has happened. And all those laws began to evolve in written form by the 2nd century. Now, the idea that you could afford two kitchens, well, that's a rather modern reality, that any one family could have double and one you don't use, or one you only use, right? Or you have a third set of dishes or a fourth set of dishes that you use only on Passover, which begins this week. And so many Jewish homes take out their Passover dishes because Passover foods or Passover utensils and foods during Passover can themselves become corrupted or can become defiled in that way. And so there's always a means of returning, of bringing it back. Okay. Yeah. Okay. It provided means by understanding the way in which we're going to keep safety and order within the community. That's part of what ritual purity laws attempt to do, such that we know what people will wear, or we know what certain people are allowed to wear or not to wear, or there's certain activities that you engage in, or certain expectations that we all share. Some of those are simply mores, and some of them are really societal norms that are enforced by effectively your neighbors, right? And then finally, and I said this before, but it really bears repeating, that all of these laws of purity, once they're recognized or once they're acknowledged, if there's been a transgression, there's always a means of bringing the folks back into the side of the good, right? They're able to be reintegrated back into society. So, Russ, I don't know if there was another question in particular that was a little deeper than just the laws of, or the ideas of purity.
This may be too technical, but back when in our corner of Christendom we were ferociously debating same-sexuality.
Right.
One of the arguments that emerged was that in Leviticus there's a word, I think it's toeva,
Yes.
in Hebrew, that is typically translated abomination.
Right.
Abominable. So the argument was that word apparently is used to describe same-sex acts between men and also to describe eating shellfish. So the liberal side of the argument said, well, look, if we're not worried about eating shellfish and that word applies there, then, et cetera. Of course, the conservatives saw it the other way. But is that a fair reading of Leviticus?
Yes. Yes. That their category of acts or activities, they're called this toiva, the abomination. And then in that world, at that time, these were verboten, right? But over time, and John is going to help us see how this evolves, the notions of what constitutes or defines purity, or the laws that you either need to adhere to or toe the line, or you can say, well, that was all yesteryear, is an evolution such that we get to the idea that it's not, and it's stated right in the text that we have for you about purity from here, it stems from the move from the idea that your body is impure or unclean, that there's something intrinsic, to the idea that we're talking about morality, and we're talking about how we engage with one another. And it sort of, it morphs the idea of how a community, a religious community, in particular Christianity, understood the notion of purity, or what we should be focused on in terms of what really matters, in terms of knowing how to comport ourselves and what's acceptable or not, moves from the physical realm to much more of the spiritual realm. Being a pure heart, for instance, is not a concept that comes from Leviticus, right? The idea about your sincerity or your intent is not what's captured in Leviticus. They're interested, the authors of Leviticus, in describing what's expected, and in the event that this isn't adhered to, here's what follows by way of punishment or by way of offering a means of returning to society. Okay, can I jump in?
Sure. Aaron talked about the idea of purity, which is quite frankly foreign to us, particularly Americans. And so it seems other, ancient, frankly kind of weird. Why do you have two kitchens? It's expressed in various ways. And I want us to think about, I'll start with how Christianity took those Jewish ideas inherited and developed, they evolved over time, and then how they really affect us today. There is certainly a sociological, cultural function, a set of those with purity. There's probably psychological, religious, something following up on what Aaron said. We could look at this as two broad categories. If you're reading Bible stories, Old Testament, New Testament, the sin or moral category is one. Homicide makes one impure. Got that. And then there's the religious ritual one, eating shellfish, not keeping kosher. These are two broadly different, it's not a either or thing, but two different categories, but there's a means of restoration for all of them. When you get to the Christian faith, particularly with Jesus, those two distinctions tend to merge together of sin as well as religious ritual. And Jesus, I would say, this is particularly for Marlene, even though he's called rabbi, which would put him more like a Pharisee as a teacher, Jesus is really more in line with the Old Testament prophets and how he goes about teaching and living and acting this out. Hosea comes to mind, is not so much concerned about sacrifice, but loyalty, sincerity before God, your openness, and so on. And so when Christianity inherited these ideas, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I'm talking about here, John's a whole nother thing, they do two things. We've talked about parables a million times. What are parables mostly about? The kingdom of God. Well done. Thank you for paying attention. I feel warm inside. The kingdom of God in Judaism, that'd be called the Messianic age. That's the vision of the world, of all of creation as God intends it. That's what the parables are about. And guess what purity is about in the Gospels too? It's in that same context of when God restores all of creation through Messiah and this whole plan, then all creation is restored, made pure, made holy. That's what's happening there. The second piece of this is directly related to that is purity in the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, is a way to show who Jesus is. And here's the wild thing that we talk about it, but from a modern, postmodern American context of words like diversity, inclusion, and transformation, crossing boundaries. Think about Jesus when he went to heal the leper. In that society, what would that mean? Leper was unclean from the skin condition. And if Jesus touched this leper, what should that technically do? Make him unclean, impure, not pure anymore. But what in fact happens in the story? The leper becomes pure. Or the 10 lepers, or Jairus' daughter, she died. He touches a corpse, human corpse, and instead of making him impure, unclean, she comes back to life, which I think is a good sign that she's made pure, made holy. And what about, for example, somebody who's possessed by a demon? Jesus drives out the evil, or he's around a prostitute, or a foreigner, or a woman, or all these categories that he should not associate with. The phrase, and this will probably come up in my Easter sermon, Jesus has contagious holiness, which I absolutely love. I wish I made that up. Everywhere, you don't have to wear a mask when Jesus is there, because everywhere he goes, he restores. Everything he touches, he makes holy and clean and pure and good. That's the example given over and over. And so these categories of pure, impure, clean, unclean, in and out, suddenly just are destroyed. They are transformed, is a better word, resurrected in that, where that Jesus coming into contact with whomever, whatever, makes that pure again. That is a profound new idea. Because where within Judaism, where was the center of holiness, the center of purity? The temple in Jerusalem. And even Jesus, notice the healing of the leper, the 10 lepers, where did he say to go? Or where did Mary, his mother, go after having him, after childbirth? They go to the temple. You've been healed already. Go to the temple, and they will declare you clean or pure. That's the idea. It still has that function. And so Jesus, and Mark says this, is the new temple. Tear down this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days as a sign of his crucifixion, resurrection. The idea becomes Jesus, the presence of God in the world, is the new temple that has that same function. So does that eradicate, get rid of, supersede the old temple? No, not necessarily. But it becomes more like the older Jewish tradition. You take God with you wherever you are. And so Jesus, with the community, the church, goes out. Everything Jesus touches becomes pure. Have you noticed that in the Bible before? It's a fascinating idea. And so those two categories of religious ritual and then sin or moral purity seem to come together. Not precisely, not in a nice, easy system like we might prefer. And everything in the Jewish scripture, too, is not perfectly aligned in categories we like to break down. But pretty generally speaking across the board, that's what he does. Aaron and I were talking about of perhaps two innovations that Jesus brought from within his tradition were to say, love your enemies. Nobody really said that before. And this of Jesus becomes the one that everything he touches becomes holy. That's a new idea. Again, it still doesn't get rid of the entire covenant, because he says over and over, follow the laws, go show the priest. But something else happens. He talks about it's not outside of you that defiles. So it's not necessarily eating a shellfish, or it's not I saw somebody from Tree of Life on the board eating a cheeseburger in our kitchen. And I'm not going to out him, but he knows that he owes me. He told me, do not tell Rabbi Myers I'm eating a cheeseburger. I'm so hungry and I'm so busy, I stopped and had one. And I was like, this is fantastic. I'm going to call in the favor when I need it, but just everybody knows right there. So he knew he violated this law anyway. But from our tradition, the Christian tradition, we would say those things aren't as important, but what is important is what comes out of your mouth. What's in your mind? How do you interact with the world? That really matters. And sometimes that's good and sometimes it's bad. We would say we have mixed emotions, mixed motives all the time. Any questions about all this? Yes?
If the temple was supposed to be a symbol of purity, why in the end does Jesus destroy it?
How did Jesus destroy the temple?
Well, on the crucifixion of the temple.
Oh, that would be a symbolic that the curtain of the temple was torn in two. The death of Jesus was so profound. There's an earthquake, there's darkness. The temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, Common Era or AD. So remember, these Gospels were written after that event happened historically, and so they're kind of reading back into that and interpreting that event. So Jesus didn't destroy the temple. It was the Romans, but in effect, everybody did it. Charles?
Why are women included as the unclean? Are they damned just by being born?
Why are women unclean? I wouldn't phrase it that way. It would be more akin to, even this way within modern Islam, I as a male should not touch a female Muslim unless I was related to her. And there's a sense of, part of it's propriety, part just good manners, and there's a sense of we don't do that. Is that fair? Unless you're related, you wouldn't do that. So it's more mixing with unchaperoned women. So he was with her in private, basically, like the woman at the well, for example. And worse, she was a foreigner. So it's like a double bad thing to be doing.
So, if I can just add to the answer? Go ahead.
I worked in a girls' school for 35 years, and we call it the Girl Factory.
The Girl Factory? May I say what the name of the Girl Factory is?
Sure.
Ellis School.
Anyway, the idea of women being condemned at birth seems very strange.
That's not what we're talking about at all. What we'd be talking about is, not to make you uncomfortable, but if you happen to just appear in the girls' changing room, what would be the reaction of everybody?
I'm going to tell Liz.
I'm going to tell Liz, you can't do that. That's wrong. That's more what we're talking about. Not women or men or a foreigner are bad in themselves, but there should be certain things where you don't mix. If you're with your sister, that's a little bit different. But if you're with an unrelated person, that becomes a whole nother category that we don't violate that. There are other things we could add, but just basically, and just about as far as I'm concerned, every culture has some, this is taboo, that's okay, depending on what the line is.
But specifically, Charles, in the biblical tradition, the concern was about bodily fluids. And so when a woman was menstruant, and for the week after, they're off limits to their husband, even say nothing of to socializing with others. And so the reason to this day that an Orthodox man will often not shake hands or come into contact with a woman is he doesn't know whether or not.
Interesting.
I mean, over and above the propriety of having a meal or being in private with someone with whom you're not married or unrelated, leaving aside those social mores, the concern is that unlike coming into contact with Jesus where only the purity goes in one direction, the concern is that if you're in physical contact with a menstruant woman, well, then you've become defiled. It's not that, that's why I hastened to say before, that between being tahor and tameh in your own bodily existence is more akin to being asleep or awake. They're not bad conditions, they just have to be remedied. Childbirth also renders the woman impure, and for a period of 30 days, and if you have a daughter, it's for 60 days. None of it sounds fair. None of it is particularly progressive in terms of being egalitarian, but those were the purity concerns. That's what, at the time, that's what drove the behavior such that men and women are separated and you don't come into contact and all kinds of other rules that are at once to describe, adhere, follow the laws of purity and also just sort of social comportment. Right? You're safer if you don't.
In the Orthodox tradition also, correct me if I'm wrong, girls don't read from the Torah because of that. They don't touch the Torah. That's the Orthodox.
Yes, Martin's pointed out that in the Orthodox tradition, women, girls, are not called to read from the Torah. Not because they're impure, but because the fear was that their voices would so entice and unsettle the men that we're going to muzzle the women. That's true. Rather than holding the men responsible for their own reactions and their own behavior, and right, we're going to put the women up in the gallery, behind the curtain. We're not going to hear their voices, lest the man in charge or running the show is aroused or distracted. So it's not a pure. That itself isn't a purity issue, but it's a social construct by way of regulating and ordering the community because it's safer this way. It's certainly not fair. Right? And for the same reason, women don't become rabbis in Orthodox traditions and the rest. Dave?
I had a religious class once, and the professor said Leviticus was there because in Christianity we believe that Jesus died and forgave our sins and all that, and that purity, and his purity part he brought up was that if we did, that sin could come from within. And that's why he had a problem with this reading, because it says that it's not what comes from within, it's what we spew out. But he said that if we continually let things come into us, it festers in there, and then we expose it. So he looked at it a little differently, and I've never heard that before.
So it's a shift from the physical act of becoming defiled, being in touch with, literally touching, or coming into contact with that which is presently impure, whether it's another person or whether it's a dead body or whether it's mixing milk and meat and what have you, right? Those are physical concerns. The evolution, the shift to making it about purity of heart or the sincerity of your intentions or what comes out of your mouth as opposed to what comes in. This is rather graphic, the text that we have here, that what goes into your mouth goes into your stomach and then soon it goes into the sewer. Wow, we get that. We get that image, versus what comes out of your mouth, the way in which you move in the world. And that shift is profound, and it happens subtly, I think, other than where Jesus makes certain pronouncements. But in terms of that being embraced by the community, this was a new idea.
Yeah. Something we could do a whole other class on, we haven't even mentioned yet, is we talk about, the scriptural tradition talks about Jesus as the Lamb of God or a sacrifice once offered. It's using the ideas of a personal sacrifice one might make at the temple or on the Day of Atonement and the priestly sacrifices being offered, that one action, and here the interesting phrase I read, blood is a detergent. That is the sacrifice of pigeons or a calf or whatever, or a ram or whatever it might be, atones for the sin of the family, the community, and so on. And that in that system, if you're thinking in that way, Jesus, as the Lamb of God, sacrificed for the sins of the world, accomplishes that. A little subtle shift that occurs particularly in the table fellowship is, I mentioned Jesus. Pharisees are more about their separateness. That's a way to express holiness. Jesus takes table fellowship, a meal, and uses as a way to bring people together. It's a celebratory feast and makes it about, a celebration for that. And so this is an offering that's shared, that's meant to draw in. And the idea of purity and making pure is about restoration more than it's about separate or sacred, or to make holy means to set apart. So it's consecrate, bless these gifts. That's to set it apart as holy. But the whole idea is to restore and bring all things, all of creation together. The word in Greek is katharos, for pure. And something I looked at, there's a book called Strong's Dictionary, which is defining the Greek. Here are a few things you might be familiar with, and I'll say it with the Greek word. Blessed are the katharos in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the pure in heart. This reading, you blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup, so that the outside also may become katharos, clean. That idea is, you only wash the outside, your body, but it's inside of you. That's what you need to clean first. That's the point he's making there. And then Joseph of Arimathea took the body of Jesus, wrapped it in a katharos linen cloth. I never got that before. It just says clean linen cloth rather than pure. It's a whole different idea. So give alms for those things that are within, and see everything will be katharos, clean for you. Give yourself fully to the world, and then everything becomes clean. So all of that is, I don't even think we can touch John the Baptist and the whole tradition, so I'll leave that there. But getting into, Aaron, do we still have purity laws in our, say, in America today?
We have, what is it, the FDA or something?
The FDA, I'm not talking about food safety or beef inspection. We wouldn't call them purity laws. We would say mores or customs, and every culture in the world has them. So think, sociologically speaking, if you are a tiny minority, the Jews, surrounded by cultures throughout your whole history who basically wanted to eradicate you or absorb you, one or the other, is that fair? Yeah. You need ways to say, we are Jewish and we're not anybody else. And so you have certain markers, what we eat, drink, how we dress, what we say, don't say, act, live, and so on, to have reinforcing communal identity. And we're not those people. That functions today. If on a Sunday in the fall, somebody wear road cone orange and brown, and everybody else is wearing black and yellow, sorry, you're from Cleveland, I know. Who's the horrible jerk walking around here? Where everybody else, we're clearly on the same team. Oh, that guy, that girl, gross. They're not part of our group. How dare you come into our city? That's a very obvious thing. Yeah.
As a healthcare professional, I think of us with COVID, masks versus no masks.
That was my next thing. So here's one, and think of 3 years ago particularly, and even now. I remember walking the dog outside. Everybody was wearing masks outside, walking the dog. And if you'd walk the dog, and if the other person didn't cross somewhere around like 30 or 40 feet, there were I got cussed at before. People flipped me off, or lots of mean looks, because you just violated some boundary. It wasn't 6 feet, it was whatever I'm comfortable with. And think of it, and I don't mean in any way to be partisan here, but can you believe the people who still wear a mask? They're afraid of everything, those libtards, excuse my language. Can you believe the people who don't wear a mask? They don't care about anybody else. They're so selfish. MAGA Republicans, or whatever. You know what, you've all heard something like this. It's so accusatory. And it doesn't just, I disagree with your opinion, you're a terrible person, and you're not in my group, and I can see that by your behavior. And if that's not a purity test, I don't know what is. And it's extremely strong right now of who's on my team and who's not on my team. And in the purity laws, if somebody is a foreigner, does that make them what? Less than us?
Different, dangerous.
Different, dangerous. I think that still, to a great degree, applies.
For sure it does.
What else are you going to say about that?
Yes.
How prevalent that is today. I think it's more prevalent than ever. People are careful about what they say. And it would also imply that when you're different, you're not better than.
Right.
That's what I think is important.
Can I say something?
Please.
We're different but not better than. I think that's true with our better angels. But in fact, that's often not true at all. Because if you don't say the right thing, in our current culture, and I mean left, right, whatever those categories even mean anymore, we are very quick to assign a label, which is by definition dehumanizing, and we may as well call people a witch. The Nazis did that. That's like people go nuclear way too quickly. The Nazis do that. Racist, sexist, homophobe, transphobe. There's no discussion after that. You're on the bad team, is what that says. And there are parallel other slurs we can give. It's meant to dehumanize, make you less than a human, so therefore I don't have to listen to you or engage with you, or bad things can happen to you. And again, this is not a left or right category. Everybody in the society, it happens all over the place. Those are purity codes. It exists at least as strongly now, and it seems more of a matter of life and death now, because it affects health, it affects politics, it affects all sorts of things. You're going to say?
One of these comments was that words matter, and more often than not these days, if you use the wrong words, right? If you don't demonstrate fealty to whatever the purity rule is. I'm thinking of just a couple of examples that come immediately to mind. You remember when Barack Obama was running for president the first time, and for a long while he didn't wear a flag lapel pin. And he was called out for not being a presidential candidate who wears a flag lapel pin. And so he got with the program and put a lapel pin on, right? So that...
Because clearly he wasn't a patriot.
Well, clearly, right. If you don't have the pin, then you're not a serious candidate for us, right?
Even though he's running for president of the country. Got it.
Right. Or if you don't have your pronouns, administrators in higher education all describe the pressure they feel to put their pronouns, lest for not having their pronouns that they are at risk of being accused by students of not creating a safe space or whatever. I'm only pointing out, my goal in this is only to point out where these types of purity laws are today. Right? John Fetterman doesn't wear, he likes to wear cargo shorts and hoodies. And that's not what senators are expected to wear. Dress codes become this way. I was asking Jonathan about the mores that might have changed over the decades in terms of what people wear to attend the 11 o'clock service. Or you remember getting dressed up for flying on an airplane at a certain time? Or
here, people wear Sunday clothes, Sunday best, church clothes. We still generally know what that means. And that's, at 11, if you came in wearing flip-flops and a tank top, it'd be like, who's that visitor and where is he or she from? But when we get to the summer and go to the garden service, it's totally acceptable to wear shorts and a t-shirt and sandals. Is it not? But if you wore that back in the next Sunday at 11, in the fall, that'd be a little weird. And that's just a cultural moray here that exists. No one says anything. There's no dress code here. But you want to continue that, it sounds like, yes. That's very important to some people.
Right. And it's usually those without power or without authority, or to use the current word, without privilege, who are challenging these mores. And maybe that's to the good. On the other hand, there's something about the collective wisdom or the way in which we've been performing up till now. They're all deserving of review. But the idea of throwing babies out with bathwater because these rituals, or these purity rituals, are archaic or are themselves grounded in a system that itself is corrupt from the start. These are the challenges that are showing up. Yeah, Michael?
It's certainly the case that America has a relaxed attitude toward dietary purity laws. To match Jonathan's memory of a character eating a cheeseburger, I've known good Catholics who on Friday would take polka and dip it in a glass of water and say, "Swim, fishy, swim."
I would say I think they're missing the point if they do that.
Well, the point is that I've had good Jewish friends from Aaron's own congregation. We have eaten at their house on Jewish holidays when they've eaten at our house. But and dietary laws help a minority like Judaism maintain its own identity. I can see that. But within American Jewry, Orthodoxy is a minority of its own. It's only about 10%.
Right.
And I'm curious, but it's a minority in Israel that seems to be exercising increasing power in deciding who gets the benefit from the law of return, what Aaron's status as a rabbi is, and so forth, in a way that I have the sense is putting a lot of American Jews under real pressure with respect to their relation to Israel. So I'd be interested in hearing Aaron talk about that function of purity as exclusionary.
You could say more generally even about minority dictating.
Yeah.
I have to go because I'm leading the service. Thank you all very much. I will leave it with a pure in heart for Aaron to lead.
All right. Thank you. All right.
No class next week.
I'll get you. Yeah. Thanks. The role of these purity laws is both. It goes in both directions. It's to tell us who we are and who's with us, because you dress or conform to whatever the mores are, or you eschew certain foods or behaviors because those are not part of what our group does. And it's a way of describing who we're not. And it sets up a means by which to transgress those norms or those rules puts you outside the group. So there's no doubt in my mind that the various dietary laws in Judaism and Islam and in other cultures were at once to create cohesion, but were not random. They were in contradistinction to what their neighbors were doing. If your neighbors are eating anything and you are restricted that way, then it's less likely that you're going to be breaking bread with them, entering into dialogue and falling in love and watering down the community in that way. By the same token, we know who we are, each of us, because of how we comport ourselves in contradistinction. So don't mistake me for that other group. They work in both ways. In both ways. Yes?
Probably the wrong time to be talking about communion, but communion is very much the same way, especially like in the Catholic Church. You may not take communion if you are not Catholic, whereas we welcome everyone.
Right.
And in Orthodox, if you haven't done certain things before leading up to it, you also may not, and if you do, you're no longer Orthodox.
That's right. So it's an internal group means of, right? Regulating that. Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I had a note here because in our conversations about it, it encouraged Jonathon in a certain direction. We were asking the questions, how are purity laws in need of review? How do they risk undermining us? So we've heard about what's going on in various campuses where various speakers are either shouted down or their invitations to speak on a campus are withdrawn, which is a terrible irony that in order to enforce inclusivity to allow all views to be heard, some voices are stifled, right, or silenced, or muzzled. The other example is in the spirit of inclusion, we're going to frustrate our ability to be as diverse as we want, because we're going to prioritize admitting certain people to the group because they have various characteristics. That might be to the good, but it's a challenge to the hegemony of these purity laws. And what Jonathan picked up on when we were talking is, he wanted me to make a note that who may receive communion? In those religious communities where everyone is welcome to come, it in some ways undermines the act of communion. Communion is available to everyone, as I understand it. And so in an effort to lower the bar or the barrier to entry and invite everyone who comes in, you're challenging the very notion of what the communion is about. It's sort of the irony of what happens if you're so open-minded that you tolerate people who are not interested in being open-minded. Well, then we have a problem. My mother used to say, if your mind is so open that your brain falls out, well, then you're not doing yourself much good, right? You may be undermining something larger. So our goal was to give you some insight into the laws of purity from the biblical tradition, that you're in this state or you're in that state. You may move between them like sleep and wakefulness, but there's always a way of returning. So too today, with various purity laws, as it were, not by whatever other name they may use, are similarly trying to determine or trying to fix who's in, who's out, what the mores are. So we just want to watch for what they do. They serve beneficial purposes, and they can come back and bite us or have unintended consequences. Okay, thanks everyone. Happy Holy Week.